everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Starting.
Get started. My name is Josie Smith. I am the Events and Social Media Coordinator for Madison Street Books. We are a new-ish indie bookstore in Chicago's West Loop. And I'm so excited tonight to be joining Jeanne Thornton and Cat Fitzpatrick. To give you just a little bit of info, Jeanne Thornton is the author of the novel The Dream of Dr. Phantom and the collection Black Emerald, both shortlisted for the Lambda Literary Award. She is also the co-publisher of the Independent Press and Star Books, and the writer and illustrator of the webcomic Bad Mother and The Man Who Made Fun. She is a 2015 Lambda Literary Fellow in Fiction and has been published in Wired, Ed+1, and the Evergreen Review. Cat Fitzpatrick is the director of the Women's Adventure Studies program at Rutgers University in New York. She wrote the book of poems Glamour Kiss and co-edited the anthology Meanwhile Elsewhere, Science Fiction and Fantasy for Transgender Writers, which won the ALA Stonewall Award the other year. She is currently working on a novel in verse about trans women in Brooklyn making terrible choices. This is a topic she knows a fair bit about. To give you a quick rundown of the evening, we are going to hear a brief reading from Jeanne from her new book, Summer Fun. Then Kat and Jeanne will go through some questions together, and then finally we'll take audience Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a little button that says Ask a Question. If you hit that, you can ask anything, and we'll get to it at the end of the evening. Otherwise, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, and I will now turn it over to Jeanne and Kat.
Oh my gosh, exciting. Okay, the feedback, can you all hear the feedback anymore? Is it okay? Yeah, we're excitingly, for a book about audio engineering and recording technology, we thought this was appropriate to begin with. Also, like, to honor the great tradition of trans women doing noise music. So preliminarily, thank you all for being here. This is actually the last event on the Brief Summer Fun Tour. I'm delighted that I was able to be interviewed by both publishers of Little Puss Press, a glorious new indie press on the scene these days. I would like to say before we begin, as I said at the other event, right? I really enjoy it when there is a very noisy chat, when people are like living it up in there. Please make an extreme amount of noise in the chat. Like if any like fool thing comes into your head to say, I would like you to say it. If any question comes to mind, I would like you to ask it. We will try to answer as many things as possible and feed off of the energy you give us this evening. That said, I'm going to move directly into the sort of audio engineering material. Can you still hear me? I have tabbed away from the main reading. Okay, so I'm going to read something to you from much later in the book. So this scene is possibly lightly spoilery, so beware. So in this scene, there's a trans woman musician named Diane who is working with session musicians called Midnight Automotive in the year 1966 on the tracks for an album called Summer Fun while her band is away on tour. Her band is also her family. She has just come out, and the album will in part be a vast statement about America and transsexuality's place within it. So as we begin, we are watching her work. Stacks of tape get higher as you bounce multiple tracks down to single ones and start new tapes from those seeds. Pitch shift up and down and call back performers for overdubs spend whole fat days marinating in chants and rhythms and harmonies destined to be chopped to 4 quick bars worth of transition between cuts. You smoke a lot. You get to the sessions early and you stay late. And at night you can't sleep, so you light candles and sing in your bathrobe to strange gods filtered through painted moonlight and lava lamps. It's some combination of these elements that gives you the idea for recording the surf rock track, Donner Pass. The plan, when you start to lay it out, is feasible in every way except financial, and you are long past letting that stand in your way. It doesn't occur to you to call Mona, your wife, until you're already bound north on I-5, refueling the hover car flotilla of your session musicians, Midnight Automotive en route through Bakersfield. All the cars in the book are hover cars, by the way. Oh, gee, how are you? You tell your wife via payphone. So I'm not going to be home tonight, or maybe for a couple of nights, because I've got to take the band into the mountains to do some recording, if that's cool, to the Donner Pass. Part of you hopes she's disappointed that you won't be home. Have fun, she says brightly. Don't eat anybody. Your initial idea is to use the tents and Colemans purchased in San Francisco to camp out at the intended recording site, just where the Donner Lake breaks off via a stretch of creek into the Truckee River, but the engineer insists you find a real hotel. We're not going to play well if we stay in a hotel, though, is the thing, you explain. The whole point is to play as if we've been destroyed from staying outside in the weather, because that's the power of the weather, which we have to get on tape. But in the end, you suck down this compromise to your vision. The hotel rooms have dark billiards green carpets and mahogany furniture with skimpy white lace curtains that barely filter sunlight, like a powdered sugar dusting over a stiff zucchini bread crust. A candied cherry painting of either a Madonna or a burning/weeping saint hangs above every bed. We need this painting for the album, you say. I'm stealing this painting. And this done, you round up everyone for dinner. In the wee small hours, pipes over the hotel restaurant PA, while you wolf complimentary garlic bread and duck and weave your head to the ring-a-ding-ding horns and strings. We need this for the album too, you insist, gesturing at the music. Maybe we need this garlic bread on the album, says the marimba player, and Midnight Automotive all laugh at you. But you consider it. You are wearing a silver blouse with a necklace you bought because it looked magical to you, and waiters are staring at you. And you miss your wife, who will not be your wife forever. Here in the mountains, you realize for the first time that this is true. But your album will be forever. And so you stare at garlic bread, and so you think about what you need from it. No one knows what to do about your room assignment. It seems obvious to you. You and your bassist are the only ladies. You wait for people to understand that for some time before you suggest it, and everyone agrees because you're paying them. They seem embarrassed, and you wish you hadn't given them cause. Your changes of clothes put away for the night in the dresser. You and the bassist settle in side by side in the twin beds, unfamiliar westerns playing in black and white on the TV. You're very brave, your bassist says to you, just as the cowboy is shot in the back. The things you endure, I can't even imagine. You make sure to smile back at her so she will feel normal and not afraid. Then you go to use drugs on the balcony. It's cold up here in the mountains, and you shiver in the melting wind. There are stars, and you imagine drifting between their waypoints in a woven raft. From some balcony below you, you can hear the male members of Midnight Automotive laughing, loud and bass, and you drop ashes on the snow heaps below you, looking out at the river. No new snow is falling, Diane. All of it just sits here, crystal and preserved, safe from summer melt by grace of altitude, nothing else. The next day you go down to the river, you and Midnight Automotive and your friends, you in white and blue with a lunar crown at the head of a delta like the small boss of all the geese, everyone hauling instrument cases and folding chairs, and your old Willensack handheld recorder. It's a state park, ill-attended on a weekday at this time of year, and you encounter no one on your way down the slopes of grass and trees that lead you to the river, framed by spiral mountains, wide as a lake in places, tightly funneled into white rapids like wet, braided lightning in others, yet constantly moving forward, and clearly it is flowing west. Everything is. Does anyone know the exact spot where everyone started to eat everyone else, you ask? It's really important that we get those psychic resonances on the tapes, okay? Ghosts are a thing you believe in now, says the sound engineer. But you ignore him. Physical resonances are a more immediate problem. The musicians need to be set up in their folding chairs as close to the water surge as possible, but the crash and roar over the stones might cancel the sounds of the instruments. Everyone waits patiently in his or her chair, tuning, as you take your trusty Willensack to different test spots, attaching different meshes and filters to the pickups. This is useless, the engineer says an hour later. No, we can't give up on this, you say. Try moving it maybe 3 inches that way, right? And then we can use this chair to make a kind of baffle, which should filter out a lot of the high pass and keep the low end loose. We need to go home, Bee, says the engineer. You ignore this. You squat on your heels and poke at the recorder, thinking about rotation, mesh pieces you might attach. If you hurt or disappoint anyone, you will be like your father was, and that can never happen. So you look out at the river, pressing forward, crashing and rolling down from the continental divide until it reaches the ocean to become waves for surfers to ride. And you imagine that your anger is rolling out with it. If you're like making a painting or something, you say, trying to explain, you can just make up whatever you want to because people are just seeing like red and purple stone, dust, and oil, right? And the pattern of the stone dust is fooling them. But if you're taking a photo, then people are seeing the real thing. You're sucking up light, right? So you've got to suck up the right light. It has to be on the tapes. And it's the same principle here. We've got to haunt the tapes. Otherwise, the album will fail. Everyone is receiving hourly wages to be here. That's all that's keeping them here now, you realize. They watch you. You watch the river. Silver current, leaf boats rushing downstream to oblivion, hidden fish spouting foam. You could float on that foam. All right, you call, turning about and clapping your hands. There's only one way out. We all need to go into the water. So your bassist puts her hand on the small of your back and slowly lowers you into the river where the settlers died. The hem of your skirt flares in the current, and silver drops bead on the leading edge of the crescent moon strapped to your forehead, then rise, sputter, baptize forever in the eyes of your congregation. Everyone, come on, get in, you shout. This is it. This is what we were missing. The bassist is the first to follow. The drummer is second. He strips off his shirt to reveal a salt and pepper iron eagle of chest hair that mats to his pectorals in the instant his cannonball strikes. Clothes soak, drag, disappear piece by piece, rush into the rapids as everyone circles and splashes and chuckles, all of them on the clock. Soon your moon crown is gone, Diane, washed away into some estuary where the wolves go, and no one besides. The only one left on the bank is your engineer, alone with an expression you can't read, among a skeleton scrub forest of empty folding chairs, stocked with instruments and cases. Record this, you command, and he is on the clock. So he takes the mic and points it at you, and the band, and the ghost water vibrations that waft from your bodies as the water kills everything bad in you, and all of you are only good now. And when you come down from the mountain, Diane, when you and your collaborators put your clothes back on and pack up the cars, you will take this entire recording and you will crop it to a tight 10 seconds behind an organ part, a glaze of joy and river scum that all but the most expensive stereo equipment will miss. But it will be there. You know that. Joy will haunt the recording, every detail of it present in the waves, your half-naked laugh, the cannibal ghosts of the river that roar in the natal surf, and you paid for all of it. But the microphone sucked this into the tapes as well, Diane. The silver jet that tears the sky open as it streams across the mountains high above you, and heading west as well. A jet just like the one that will soon bring your family, your band, back to you. You can hear their voices singing now, better than anything microphones can record. Soon you will help them too. Okay, thank you all very much. And now I'm extremely excited to talk about this with Cat. I selected this part of the book specifically to read with you because I think this tracks with conversations we have had about like what it means to do projects like as trans women with trans women, right? And I feel like I would like for us to bring some of that energy tonight.
Oh my God, Jeanne, that's like so beautiful. That was such a beautiful reading. I am like kind of overwhelmed right now. I have to ask you questions and like manage a conversation or something instead of just collapsing. Wow. Oh my god. That is like one of the two. I mean, it's not related to the other one. That is like one of the two things I think about most in this book. Like that kind of scene of like the way that technique is actually something you have to do. Anyway, question. Yes, question. I have 4 questions.
Okay.
The first question. One of the things I love about this book is the fact that it's in letters. And it's not obvious that this book should be in letters. Like, if you told someone the story and then you were like, I'm going to write it in letters, I'd be like, who to? Who from? Like, where are the letters going to work in this? But obviously, the fact that letters is like pretty situation, and the craziness and style is also that it puts you like so deep inside someone's like working of magic just in the course of reading the book. I also know that you have a lot of opinions about kind of letters as a transform. So I wanted to start by asking kind of why the book came to be an epistolary novel, and also perhaps what its epistolariness has to do with its transness.
What its epistolariness has to do with its transness is what you said? What you asked at the end?
How did it become an epistolary novel? How did that process? How did it become an epistolary novel? What was it like to write an epistolary novel?
Totally.
Tell us about letters.
I will tell you about letters. You know, I have a lot to say on this topic, right? Since we had an elaborate exchange about this, where you have more to say on this topic, honestly, than I did, since you successfully realized that the entire internet is a kind of like terrible letter that all of us are sending and receiving to one another at every moment. And that's sort of, I will speak around this a little bit, because I think that answering the first part about how the book started is about letters. I talk about this in an essay that I've shown you, but when I was first coming out as trans, like 11 years ago or something now, right? It was a fairly gradual process, and there was like kind of a Venn diagram situation where there were people who were very, very close to me in my life would know, and people who lived far enough away that I only knew them through the internet often knew, but no one else, no one in that large excluded middle territory knew, right? And I think like the interesting thing is that it was either friends that were like friendships and relationships that were very, very intimate and such there was a very great deal of trust involved, or there were people for whom I could like, this is going to sound crazy to say, but it's like they only knew about me what I told them. Which is a very liberating position to be in when you're trans and just coming out, right? And you have all this anxiety about how am I presenting myself in the world? Like just these very, very fundamental, almost existential questions that you have early in transition, right? Like, is the name I have chosen stupid, right? Like, is there like, I don't know, there's like this whole element of when you're sort of existing just as a soul on a page. I described this to a friend that I was writing to at one point as being like a ball of light who could kind of like communicate genderness without bodiness, right? I think like for me, the experience of transness has almost nothing, for a long time, had almost nothing to do with bodies, right? Although I wouldn't say that now, right? So I think that the idea of this very, very disembodied like trans voice really comes out of that being my first experience of coming out. And also just a sort of fascination with, and this is something I'm sure I've talked to you about, the idea of the letter as being the letter that you sort of like look in on as being the sort of exciting strain of literary tradition, right? Like we've talked at length about Dear Mr. Samuel Richardson and his like disgusting predilections and such, right? Like you've told me many things about the sort of like way poetry circulates in the 17th century being like very like you almost weren't published. You just sent a letter to someone and then it was like gauche to have a book, right? I think that something about this sort of deep roots in the way that like a lot of 18th century texts are really like found texts, right? Like that it's like, oh, this like Cervantes happened to stumble on the manuscript of Don Quixote at this like terrible market stall, and he only found part of it, which is why there's only part one or something. And that's like, we're all just, it was socially okay. It was like socially expected that you just like go with it. Like it's socially expected that you just believe novelists when they tell you things like that. Something about participating in this grand formal tradition was exciting to me. I think that answered was that? I know that we can talk forever about this, and I would love to if you would like to do that. Although I know you have an agenda of questions.
Yeah, I mean, I have many more questions. Yeah, I think that the lesson thing is totally that thing about loneliness, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also, I think the power of it also is the way that it kind of includes and creates an audience, even in the process of including and creating a speaker. That like this is a book where someone writes to someone to tell them their own life story.
Yeah.
Because they need that life story to be told to them from a different perspective. Like there's that kind of act of like writing somebody else into being through the kind of communication in letters, like mutual validation. Which is something like maybe that like Diane is doing as well in the kind of scene that you were reading, maybe. Okay, next question. Yeah, that like I guess I'm arguing the thing I'm saying back to is kind of I think letters are a way of kind of willing trans community into being out of loneliness. That when you have nothing, when you have no one you can talk to, when you feel isolated, letters are a way of like making this connection that you otherwise don't have. And I also think that that's like a kind of recurrent concern of this book, right? These people who are like trying to build forms of like sociality, like, and that's something that's happening between Gala and Diane. Diane is like both trying to, Gala is both trying to bring Diane into her life, like so to like bring herself into Diane's life. She's like, we will be best friends. You don't know it yet.
Yeah.
And then relation that kind of goes on between Diane and Rhonda, which is this kind of more kind of compulsory one, but also is about like building a relationship in this kind of space. But then also there's this amazing scene, which apart from the one you read is my other favorite scene in the book.
Tell me.
Which is where like Diane, before she comes out, meets this woman Lana, who is like the girlfriend of her manager, I think, Harry.
Mm-hmm. Harry Carell.
The manager, whatever he is. So kind of anyway.
The A&R man.
She kind of stumbles into her room and Lana like gives her marijuana, and they have this conversation in the course of which they like gradually clock each other as trans. Like first of all, Diane clocks that Lana's trans, and then she has this breakdown, and then Lana's like, oh, right, I see what's going on here. And at the end of it, there's kind of this line where there's kind of Lana has had a lot of conversations. Like this is something that's happened to Lana on more than one occasion. So this is a kind of anyway, and I think it's kind of a theme. It is also about like kind of imagining this possibility of transsociality in this situation where we're told you can't imagine, which in this instance is the 1960s. I mean, there aren't that many. But for a long time, it's hard to get representations of trans people talking to each other, and even in the kind of memoirs that we have from people from the 60s, those scenes are maybe relatively rare. So I kind of wanted to ask you, what was it that kind of went into kind of writing this scene? How did you conceive of this scene? What did you do kind of research to make this scene? Where did the scene come from? And what is it that this kind of vision of possible kind of 60s transsociality kind of passed to you and possibly even to your readers?
Totally. I also like that scene a lot. That's one of my. I would love to read that scene at one point, but it's like actually like 40 pages long or something. It's like a lot. When I was even thinking of reading it tonight, and then it was just like some kind of psychic instinct that it's just way too long. But that scene, you asked about sort of where this comes from, or like what research went into it. And I'm ashamed to say that with all of my writing, I think as little research as possible sort of underlies it in some ways. There's a certain like, or about certain selective things. I think all of my books come from some kind of like, or at least to date have come from some kind of governing obsession where it's like, I'm going to think about this. I find myself thinking about this thing exclusively, like relating everything back to it, right? Like so far with the first book, it was like Scientology. This book, it's like certain bands of the 1960s.
Unnamed bands.
Certain unnamed bands of the 1960s, right? The one after it is going to be about like video games of the 1990s, current ones about therapy and exoplanets and such, right? I think that like that stuff is sort of doesn't feel like research because it's sort of I'm pulled into it, right? And then these other elements kind of come into it as they need to. Like famously, when I was first writing, not famously, but when I was first writing this book, I like wrote this whole elaborate scene with a drive-in theater where they're playing at a drive-in theater. So I thought like, oh, this would be amazing if the band is playing for this audience of like teenagers sealed in cars. And I didn't even think about the fact that the drive-in theater doesn't project sound, right? That doesn't even make sense. You have to like, I don't know. It was just like how do you do that? How do you write a whole scene that's totally predicated on being in a drive-in theater and like not research how a drive-in theater works? I think this sort of cavalier quality to the past is kind of fundamental to the process, and also of like the way that the 1960s trans scenes, I will tell you, like some of the antecedents that went into that one specifically was actually thinking about Amanda Lear, who was like just as part of there's like a Salvador Dali connection in the book, right? Like Gala is like named after Salvador Dali's wife, like long-suffering wife is sort of one of the early weird decisions in the book. In reading more about that, I came across this strange eddy of the fact that Salvador Dali has this like transsexual muse, Amanda Lear, who later hooks up with like Roxy Music. She's on the cover of various albums. He tried to get her into the Jodorowsky like Dune movie to play Princess Irulan and stuff. Like it was actually one of the conditions where like Jodorowsky came to him and says like, I would like you to be in my movie and play the Emperor. And he says like, I don't want to be in your movie, but Amanda Lear does. So I will have her be in that, right? Something about this dynamic is this specific vibe. Like I'm writing, I've since read more about trans lives in the 1960s, and this being this kind of like strange path that I think a number of people took, where it's like, you really want to transition, you somehow find a way to leave America to do it. You somehow find a way from America, you somehow find a way into like entertainment world, into like sex work world, into like some of these like demi-monde spaces where transition is possible. And then you sort of get scooped up by these like sometimes bad men who like pull you out of it and then just go super stealth. Like I think Andrea Long Chu wrote in this journal article somewhere about wanting to bring back the figure of the transsexual specifically, like these sort of like 1970s trans women who want to kind of disappear into transness. I felt like this was, I try to not have a huge plan about what I'm doing a lot of the time when I'm writing, right? Because I think the sort of the good ideas come when you don't have a strong plan. But I felt like something about that field of things, that kind of like deep self, deeply like restrained existence, and the idea that Diane would sort of encounter this person as this kind of like, I don't know, caged bird, like encapsulated, like totally internal, totally isolated transness, right? Felt just very compelling. It's a thing that I regret about the book, that it doesn't have a more rich view of 1960s transness, that like there really is just a lot of stuff that's interesting going on at that time. But I think that, I don't know if I've answered your question or if I'm just talking in circles in the way I sometimes do.
I mean, I think you kind of answered the first part of the question, which is like, as you come to this, maybe the second part is like, I don't know, maybe this is a question I should answer as a reader. Maybe it's an unfair question to ask of a writer. Is like, why is that scene so important?
I know.
Like, why is it that this depiction of kind of this sort of encounter, and the possibility of like this kind of casual encounter in the 60s, seems like such a powerful thing to read? Like the possibility of imagining that seems so moving. The idea that could have happened, even if it didn't, it could have.
Yeah.
Seems like such a moving.
There's something about those connections that shouldn't happen in some ways, I guess, is like sort of fundamental. That there's like, just like, I don't know, a lot of this was written, a lot of the decisions about the book were written when I was like in a fairly isolated state, right? Like being a lot of this, the key decisions about the book were written after I had like not had my job anymore in New York after coming out and moved back to Texas, and was living in like a situation with not a ton of connection with other like out trans women at the time, right? In this way that like, it's, the story is more complicated in retrospect in some ways, but it's also like, it was something I remember when I was coming up with a lot of this stuff. It was like literally sitting in coffee shops in Austin, thinking about what the next scenes would be, thinking about what where the outline was going to go, and just feeling this tremendous yearning for community. That, you know, Gala is endemic in sort of the other story of the book, which is the, you know, the woman Gala in the present and like Rhonda. Mm-hmm. And it sort of comes out in here too, where that's paired with like Diane and Lana. And the fact that they literally have just this one moment that they almost shouldn't have. I don't know, just thinking about the absolute loneliness of those times if you're sort of in one of those circumstances. Like I think about, I've been reading recently about Alicia Brevard, right? Where she sort of went through like left trans community behind and just had like 2 straight marriages, both of them completely stealth. Mm-hmm. Like, and a whole acting career totally stealth in this period of time. Like, what is that like? Like, I haven't read her autobiography, but that's actually a wild experience, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. To this day, Amanda Lear like nice fan. She's like, no, me, no, absolutely not.
Yeah, that's fair. I probably shouldn't have like asserted that she was trans in this reading, but
April Ashley married like 5 people and had an affair with Omar Sharif.
Who did? Amanda Lear?
April Ashley.
April Ashley had an affair with him and Omar Sharif. That's exciting.
Yeah, totally.
I think I'd read that in generally that Omar Sharif likes the dolls, right? Is that like...
Yeah, I heard that Omar Sharif is maybe kind of like that. That's a distraction of Omar is a very handsome man.
Good old Omar Sharif.
Maybe my question is answered now. Third question.
Okay, let's keep going.
Question. But it's also a question about like America, capital letters, capital A America. I just had kind of 2 questions where I guess we've been talking about this kind of like sort of a trans novel, and that's only one way to kind of see this novel, so kind of related to histories of like trans memoirs, trans lives, trans other kind of trans novels. But it's also very much this kind of state of America novel in this kind of big way, right? It is kind of focusing on this kind of sort of quintessential music of kind of American and prosperity and world power, moments of like, I don't know, what America sometimes likes to claim it is. And I think if one way to read it is in relation to like trans writing, then another way to read it is in relation to this kind of position of kind of big, comic, hyper-realistic American novels, of which I think probably like Jonathan Franzen is probably the kind of key kind of current exponent or something.
The Americanist of novels.
I think of that story about him like writing that article being like, all American novels are bad now. Let's go away for 5 years, and then coming back and being like, now written the great American novel.
Totally.
Like, Jonathan Franzen, well done.
That article is called "Perchance to Dream." It's like,
and so there are definitely like, I feel like there's definitely passages in this book that like feel a little like kind of Franzen-esque to me, especially the ones that are like tracing back up family trees, or even that opening with the dog. Kind of could be in a Jonathan Franzen.
Oh, totally, yeah.
And so I kind of wanted to ask, on the one hand, this relates to trans stuff, how on the other hand does it relate to these, like, cis dudes, and specifically Jonathan Franzen, but also more generally, like, kind of the American sort of deep bracket cis dude novel?
Totally. This is, like, one of these, like, I love that both of us are, like, thrilled and appalled when you compare my work to Jonathan Franzen. Like, part of me wants to just like light up and glow, right? And part of me is just like, oh no, I thought Cat was my friend, right? But okay, yeah, like I have to own that in a certain sense, right? That like when I started, I've been writing this book for a long time, right? Like when I started writing the book, I was like 26 when I made a lot of these key decisions. I was 26, right? And when I was 26, I like loved Jonathan Franzen, right? I think it was like The Corrections had come out, like Purity had yet to, not Purity, the one before it, Freedom had yet to come out and like be this kind of moment of like, who's this guy, right? I don't know. Some of this, I remember you said that you did not like The Corrections ever, right? Which is proves that you're a finer critic than I. But
I live in purity and rigor.
Yeah, and there are still things I do. There are still things I do like about The Corrections a lot, right? Like I love the part that feels to me like a capsule parody of Atlas Shrugged with like the daughter. Like it really feels like that's just like like a piss take on Atlas Shrugged in a way that I love, right? But I really felt when I was starting this book, there was this sort of like overweening ambition that I think is baked into the transliterary project in some cases, or at least the transliterary project as it manifested in a series of years, right? Like the sort of like early rallying cry to like Topside was like, we're like the best novels of all novels, right? There's sort of an attempt to capture the center in the same way that Jonathan Franzen was also trying to capture the center, right? To really think about like, I want American literature to just like zoom and refocus on where I'm at right now. And that should be part of our goal as the project of transliterature, right? I think that was the sort of nascent goal I had in the back of my head when I was like a 26-year-old and starting this book, thinking like, I'm going to write a book that could be one of those big Central American books, but it's also going to be about transness. And that's also reflected in the book in this kind of grisly mirror, where that's also what Diana's trying to do with like Summer Fun, right? That it's going to be like, I'm going to take this music that's like super American, that like tracks with sort of potential historical antecedents of the band, right? That are like so American that Americans sometimes don't like it. Like, you know, like I think that the band that may be in question has always been a lot more popular. Certain periods of it have always been a lot more popular, I think, in the UK and in Japan specifically than they ever have been at home, right? Where at home there's sort of like a certain set of very like girl and car songs that are kind of the canon that's accepted, right? I think that like, that said, I think that sort of in the long process of writing this book, I think that like just growing older and spending time with the characters and really thinking about looking at the story from all perspectives. This is something that I try to talk to my students about, is that like when you're writing a very, very long book, you're going to start out very close to one character and really, really think that that's the lens through which you have to view everything, right? And that you're telling the story of that character and really doing justice to that person in some ways, right? And then sort of as you go on, your sympathy is naturally going to shift to all the others until you slowly arrive at something that feels a little bit more like reality in ways that can't even, like, I even want to say can't be intentional, that are just a function of time. Maybe this is confessing one of my own limitations to say that, but I really do think that like sloughing the skin of yourself over time is like a necessary part of that artistic process, right? So I think that even though the book began as an attempt to like, I'm going to do Jonathan Franzen, but trans, right? Like, I just will absolutely own that was the intention going into it. It's going to be this big American story about this big American band that's about manifest destiny and all this stuff, right? And then over time, like I start to realize like, that's a silly ambition. And that starts to be reflected in, I think that just like the book starts to become more ironic about that. The book starts to become more like, this is an absurd thing to do. This woman is like absolutely isolating herself in the act of doing this in some ways. Mm-hmm. And just that attempt to capture the center in the first place, rather than to sort of find the people you're actually connected to and attempt to build something out and not care about where the center is kind of very deeply baked in. So it's like, that said, the book is still constructed on the corpse, the like steel corpse of Jonathan Franzen in some ways, right? Like it is a house made of his bones. It always will be, right? But I would like to believe that like it is introduced to necrosis to those bones. I don't know how to extend that metaphor. I can't write.
Amazing. That's amazing. Totally.
Cool.
I will say that I felt something similar as kind of a reader. Okay. Final question, and we'll get into more.
Oh my God, question 4. Amazing.
And maybe this is maybe like a kind of tying together a little bit of some of the other questions, I think, through talking about something completely different. So I kind of, we've talked about like maybe 2 ways of seeing this book. One is as like kind of a novel about like transsexuality, and kind of inventing that. One is a kind of a sort of great American novel about the state of America. And I mean, as you said at the beginning, this is a book that has cover cards. Yeah, the fucking hover cards, man. Like, what the fuck? It's so brilliant and weird. But like, I think maybe you can use this as kind of a speculative novel, as a kind of sort of a piece of genre fiction or speculative fiction.
Yeah.
There's kind of an idea which kind of there actually is. It's like been repeated too many times by random people for me to actually figure out who the hell I first heard this from. But this idea that like what you can differentiate kind of genre and kind of literary fiction is that like literary fiction gets kind of rely on a reality that we more or less know exists and a kind of set of rules that we more or less accept. whereas genre fiction like, do the work of telling you what the rules are for this work. That's kind of the world building thing, right? And that's the key difference between speculative and kind of literary fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, it's a literary fiction novel, but in other ways, there's a lot of world building. And I mean, I think that's maybe related to kind of a historical novel. So the historical novels definitely, in some ways, are a form of genre. Like I read Wolf Hall, and I'm like, oh, this is kind of a genre novel, right? This is kind of a science fiction novel.
Do you remember the time the other day where we were just like shitposting about like Walter Scott from a bar?
Totally.
It's like a week ago. We were just making like drunk tweets about like Ivanhoe. Why did we do that? Go on. I'm sorry.
But yeah, like even more than a historical novel, this novel is like alternative fiction.
Mm-hmm.
I like kind of almost like of like what if Brian Wilson was trans? Like Harry Telsav is like, what if Germany won the Second World War? And you're like, what if Brian Wilson was trans? It's a kind of similar impulsive way there, but it's kind of an alternative history novel. Like down to that you constructed this discography. You have these like documents and kind of structures of this alternative reality. And definitely, I think one of the things about it is how good the world building is, and why the hover cars are interesting, because it forces you to confront that fact. So I kind of wanted to ask about the process of building this world, about this kind of as world building, about how did you do this? Why would you have wanted to build this alternative America with hover cars and transsexuals? And what kind of magical outcome you might possibly hope for from the construction of such an elaborate ritual?
Earlier in the conversation, we talked about how I try not to know what I'm doing when I do these things, right? The hover cars were, I should talk about them first, which is like the impetus for that. And they came very, very late. I think my agent was already out trying to sell the book. And I told her like, oh, great news. I've done another version where I've changed all the cars to hover cars consistently and established this whole world about the cars. And she was like, I don't think she ever responded to that email, right? Like she took out the hover car version, but it was just like, I don't know. I just remember I got to enjoy telling people that I had made that edit, that all the cars had become hover cars now, just to see how people reacted to that. Because it's like an objectively really like, disturbed thing to do, I feel on one level. But the idea that I had behind it was just sort of this, there was this evocation of the idea that like in the past cars could fly, that this is sort of the feeling of this. It's a way to sort of, it felt sort of spiritually correct to do that, to do the hover cars. It felt like exciting to try to write it in a way that it was unambiguous that the cars in the book were flying cars, but also so that you didn't really notice it. Like I think you notice it, but it never becomes obtrusive, at least in my mind, right? And that felt like a technical challenge that I was excited by. And also just to like, there's, because you said like, you said the words Brian Wilson, so I can say them now, much like a vampire has to be invited in first, right? Basically, there is a concern in writing a book whose conceit is like, what if Brian Wilson but trans, right? In like people taking that very, very literally in ways that I don't think, like I should say for the record, I guess, that I have no, like, I think this is an interesting question, but it's not like I have a theory about this or something. But either way, right? If this person isn't trans, right, that's like a heavy thing to do. And if this person is trans, that's a worse thing to do, right? Like outing somebody without like putting somebody in that space, right? So I think like I really wanted to, even though I do think like thinking that someone is trans is usually, and I've talked to you about this before, usually a form of compliment. Like, oh my God, that person is so cool. I really love this book. They must be trans, right? That's like, it's just like, if I think like, I wonder if that person's trans, it means like I like them. I think they're great. Like, so that said, I think like having like obviously you can read the book and be like, oh, this is a book about how like Brian Wilson's trans, right? Wonder if the author really means that. And it's like, the author doesn't mean that because all the cars are hover cars. Do you know what I mean? Like there's this sort of immunization in that of anybody taking this too seriously, although I guess this like Foucault's pendulum teaches us like that doesn't actually work. In terms of the world building generally, I think that and I do want to move to audience QA, but to leave some time for that, although I think we're not on like a super ironclad deadline here. In terms of the world building, the goal with the book was to write something that was sort of, I had this conception of like the Brian Wilson and like Smile story is this kind of like American, like Paul Bunyan, like legend, right? That there's something so deeply American about that story about like, oh, this like frontier genius who like starts producing, they builds up this band from nothing. And it's like the family through true grit and determination does it. And then like sort of reaches too far at the sun and then commerce destroyed everything, right? That's this very broad strokes American legend. Like Americans like, Corinne Manning like wrote this wonderful review of the book in the Brooklyn Rail that I absolutely love, where they write this line about like Americans like to know why things fail. And I think that's what's so compelling about the legend of like the Beach Boys in particular, right? It's this question of like, why did this fail? I think that I wanted to do a story that hit the story beats of that legend, that told, Cat, you're gone. I'm talking to nobody. Oh no, you're back. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Did you hear my stuff, or like I don't know what was?
Yeah. I was muted and I was trying to get the bookstore to sort it out so I could then cover the questions from the audience. Sorry about that.
I shouldn't ask you about it because Americans like to know why things fail. Why did our technology fail us? It's all we have. But yeah,
I was riveted by your answer. Extremely interesting.
Totally. Okay. So it was like, but it was an attempt to tell that legend. It was an attempt to tell that story about like how to, like the broad strokes of this in a way that hopefully became more and more ironic as I got older and more like sick of soul, in time. But to do so by going through as few of the actual facts as possible. So to think about the inner dynamics of that legend and try to arrive at them by different means. And I think the thing that I think was interesting in that was that, what's up?
Like the Don Quixote in Borges.
Yeah, totally. It's like this. You could look at this book as basically the Quixote of Pierre Menard. I did not think about that, but that's really terrible. I have to think about that a lot now. And the thing I think was interesting was just how hard that was to do. Like how many times I would try to very much vary like the family dynamics, for example, of the Get Happies are very similar to the Beach Boys in some ways, right? Originally, this was not the case. I tried to see if I could reduce the band to its sort of most elemental qualities, which is a thing that other people have written fiction about this band have tried to do. Like I think Paul Quarrington's Whale Music is the big antecedent I know about, where he tries to reduce the Beach Boys down to just Brian and Dennis and sort of bring in as much as Tom Happy. I actually had this theory while listening to a Jim Steinman solo recording the other day, right? Like his album Bad for Good, that like, I think that the difference between Jim Steinman and the Beach Boys is that you have to have like a Brian, a Mike, and a Dennis, and you have to have a Carl, right, to make the Beach Boys, and sort of like an Al will bring in certain elements as well, right? But if you think about Jim Steinman as being sort of like simultaneously Brian Wilson and Mike Love with sort of a wish to be Dennis, I think that this explains why Jim Steinman's output is like uneven. Those people shouldn't exist in the same soul. This is a deep dive into Jeanne's interests here, but I will say that I think, getting back to your original point about world building, right? I think that trying to go as far away from the legend as possible, and then sort of realizing what parts of the legend really matter in the course of trying to doing that, and realizing like, no, there's something very true about that, was a way of sort of getting inside it and understanding what made this all work, what made this family work. I hope that answers your question.
Jeanne, those are like brilliant answers. I hope someone is fucking recording this, because that ought to be transcribed to posterity.
I hope there's a curse on the book, right? And that none of the recordings will survive.
Also, okay, they could become legendary. I suppose also I kind of wonder, it's a bit like there's always that thing with alternative history, which is like, in several hundred years, if all of Western civilization burns down and this book survives, maybe it becomes the actual history. That's sort of the thing that's always nice about alternative history.
I told because there's also or go on. Yeah, totally. We should. Do you want to? Huh?
I was going to push us to audience questions, but you should say something first.
No, let's do it. Let's go to audience questions. I'm stoked. I'm ready.
We have 4 audience questions. Somebody wants to know about the Donapart. It's a very general question about the Donapart. Tell us more things about the Donapart.
God, that's another point at which I didn't do a lot of research in the book. I think just beyond knowing, like, I looked up the Donner Party part of the book was just like, at a certain point, this gets back to world building in some ways. I was compelled by the need to write, like, sort of the track list of Summer Fun in the book. The album that they're making is sort of like a cruise through Manifest Destiny in the way that it's sort of Historical Antecedent Smile also is, right? At a certain point, the idea that, like, in the course of westward expansion, we're going to sort of run into that incident felt very inevitable early on, but I did very little research other than just sort of looking up what the actual spot looked like and trying to figure out what a recording session around that would happen. I do think it's sort of like, if you're going to have a surf rock band and you have the opportunity for them to write a song about cannibals, that feels inevitable. That's really all I can say about it. I do shockingly little research for these things. Oh no, Kat, you're muted again. Oh no, terrible. What can we do? No, down with research, Sybil. Josie says turn video on and off again. Oh my God, there was some horrible firework or gunshot or something out here, guys. It's intense things going on. Kat, are you unmuted now? No. Okay, she's going and coming back. What about now? Yes, you're back.
I turned on HD video. That works. The next question. Somebody wants to know, talk about how Gala first got and what those first experiences were like.
Oh my goodness. I have honestly not thought about that question very much. I think, like, Gala has precious little history. In the book, she has almost effectively none, right? And I think, like, even in
she makes that statement, right? Like, nothing about me.
Yeah, that was originally at the end of the book, and I realized that it needed to be at the beginning of the book because people were upset. But if you learn that at the end of the book, it sort of is like troubling to people that they've spent all this time with you. But I think getting it all out there early on. I think that there's one scene very, very early in the draft. This might have even been from like 2009 or something that has like personal history with Gala, right? Where she's like, I think she's like working as an art model was the scene. It's like the one scene about Gala not in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, in the entire, like, that I've ever written, ever, right? So it's a lot of her history was it was deeply mysterious. I know very little about her. I know that she came to this place for 8 months. I definitely know that she got into magic before coming to this place. What a question. Because I feel like if I keep trying to answer it, I'm gonna like talk too much about a personal interest in magic, and I definitely don't want to do that.
We'd be happy to talk about the personal interest in magic for everybody here.
I can definitely talk about a weird early intuition about what magic might be as a way of answering this question. So there was this idea that I had when I was in high school, I think this was, in 9th or 10th grade, where I had this like pendant I had bought from the mall at one of those like kiosks where you buy cool stuff like incense and pendants and things, right? And I had this idea that if all that it was to have a sort of sacred or magical object was to like use it a lot until it acquired history over long use, right? And that this was something you could deliberately do. Like you could make a sacred object by attempting to do this now, right? I think this is an intuition a lot of people have, right? I think that something about that idea that if you just sort of like whatever you do in a given moment is going to become relevant with repetition is, I guess, somehow deep in the practice of this work. It's probably deep if I try to connect that to Gala, and assuming she had a similar like magical root or something like that, right? Like a similar intuition that if you repeat something often enough, it becomes meaningful, like a kind of very like holy minimalist, like Garecki's Symphony No. 3. I'm mispronouncing that composer's name, but like the one where it's like the sad songs composer. Or like Spiegel im Spiegel or something like that. You just repeat it as often as possible and then like until meaning arises. I feel that this is probably somewhere deep in Gala's practice. I know there's a scene, and I don't know if it survived into the finish, but like a lot of stuff came out of this book over the years, right? There's definitely a scene where she's attempting to listen to one of the Get Happy's albums over and over until it disappears as a way of getting to like a place where she can think clearly about things. And I feel like that practice probably came in there somewhere. Thank you, Carrie, for like supplying the name of this composer, so we can all go out and rock out to Garecki's No. 3 after this event. I will definitely be doing that. What are the questions we got?
I have a question. Out of Get Happy's catalog, and it's specifically the Get Happy's catalog, as listed in the beginning of the book, what is A, the worst album, B, the best album, and C, your favorite album?
This is an incredible question. It's an incredible question. It requires me to consult my arc of the book. Just to remind myself of this band's works, right? I definitely have a soft spot for Burgers and Cokes at the Drive-In. I think that is an early, is that the name of it? Burgers and Cokes Gosh is like the name of it. Burgers and Cokes Gosh is kind of an early intimation of greatness. I think they're still stuck in the formula. They're still sort of finding their way. Like B is still like finding her way toward like a sort of transcendence, or Diane is sort of finding her way toward a sort of transcendence. And we're still working by rote. We're still working off of like Tom Happy's visions and things. But there's something that is breaking through. There's a certain sense of like impatience with formula that is coming through, right? I think that what are the other... Surf and Safari is pretty great. I think that if we're looking at this in a parallel way, like the Beach Boys Today is like the first great Beach Boy album, but also All Summer Long is the first one that I think is any good. But we're not talking about that band. The worst album... No.
Get Happy.
I think the worst album by the Get Happys is probably... either the Get Happy's Love Drive-In, just because it has deep bad vibes, right? Or Drive-In to the Movies, the Get Happy soundtrack songbook. I think that one, I don't know, for pure spiritual badness, I think that there's one in here that has this like terrible name that's like Girls Need to Listen or something. Girls Need to Listen, 15 Great Love Songs by the Get Happys. That one is like, it's kind of a spiritual black hole. Avoid. As far as my personal favorite album by the Get Happys, I would have to say Happy Mountain. I think that is deeply underrated. I think it is a time of sort of haste and the grace that comes out of haste. And I think that is more valuable. Like speaking about like throwing over Jonathan Franzen is some sort of ideal, right? I think that attempting to make grand statements that capture the center is far less valuable than attempting to capture fleeting perceptions in very short, very felt texts is kind of the formula that I want to use, right? I think that the things I would like to write from now are not going to be these big old tentpole novels. They are going to be things that attempt to just quickly and accurately grab thoughts and moments so that they are it's aware that they're arranged in some kind of bizarre structure that will emerge from the totality of them rather than anything else, right? And I think it will tickle your ears with a grace and lightness comparable to the piano. I don't know the term for this, like the Richardandos or something. I don't know anything about music from the Happy Mountain album of 1968. Did I invoke Lukash? I will. It's also going to have a lot to do with Lukash.
We have time. We have time for one more question.
Okay.
This is from Lamb. I would like to answer kind of like stuff up, and how would you prefer less prepared if you had to eat? Two-part question.
Excellent questions. I do not think I would. I defy and resist the imposition of a narrative where I would have to eat human flesh, right? Even though that is maybe we are all in Omelas, and that is the destiny of us all. I will choose not to honor that destiny in my imagination. I will choose to attempt to only imagine a different path in a way that is perhaps perverse and perhaps useless to those of us suffering in Omelas, but is also perhaps not. In terms of, as a writer, you're obligated to make stuff up. Yes?
I don't think you answered if you have more to say, go.
I don't know. I think that sort of if people have read the comic of From Hell, right? There's this sort of like, I guess like the talk always turns to Alan Moore at some point. I think it did at the beginning of the last event, and it'll do at the end of this event somehow. Maybe that's meaningful. I don't really like Alan Moore that much, but be that as it may. There's a scene in From Hell where like it talks about the phony psychic who's been advising Inspector Aberline about the Jack the Ripper case, and talks about how he was just making all of this stuff up about it being like William Gull being the Ripper and all these different things, right? Just like faking psychic visions in order to try to get some advantage from the police, right? He says like, I made it all up and it came true anyway. I think that there is a sort of eeriness with writing where you find yourself writing things and then either they happen later or you realize that the lie you were attempting to tell, sort of this we were talking about with research, is going to gradually tend toward needing to come home to reality in a certain place, right? I find that like the things that I'm happiest to think of later that I've written are usually the things that remind me of something that actually happened, that I see like I sort of went on a long voyage to come back to. I'm very excited to see in the chat that some of my friends have had this eerie experience of writing things and then they come true. I would like to talk about that more, but probably we're out of time to talk about any of these things, right? And I think instead, like...
one day your book... yeah, but I think we're done. Thank you for the game. Thank you for like amazing reading and amazing answers. And thank you to Madison for having us. Jesus,
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Busy. Thank you so much, Madison Street Books, for having us. This was so much fun. Kat, thank you so much for talking to me from across the ocean. I'm very excited. It makes sense.
Kat, thank you both for joining us. This was so much fun to listen to. I apologize again for all of our technical difficulties. But I hope everyone enjoyed the event and has a great evening.
Thank you all.